Before the world got busy with grand inventions and loud machines, there were smaller stories, quiet ones, about the things that slowly shaped our days. Stories that didn't sparkle or shout, but stayed with us, softly, like a hum you only notice when the room goes still. Tonight's story is one of those. It's about something you see every day, something sitting quietly on your table right now. It's not a hero, not a legend, not even something you'd normally think about. It's a fork, just a simple fork. But like most simple things, it's carried a long, gentle journey, from fire and stone to silver and steel, to the drawer beside your kitchen sink. So take a breath, let the day fall behind you, and as the room grows quiet, let's wander back to where it all began, when dinner tables looked very different, and the story of the fork was still waiting to be told. And so, our story begins not in a palace or a grand hall, but at a quiet table long before the fork ever existed. In the beginning, there were hands, strong, simple, unbothered hands. They lifted food straight from the fire, tore bread apart, shared fruit between friends, and somehow that was enough. People didn't think much about it. The warmth of food, the closeness of others, that was what mattered. No one needed tools for that. There was comfort in the touch, in the feel of the meal itself. The first tables were rough pieces of wood, uneven, marked by time and work. Meals were small, sometimes quiet, sometimes full of laughter, but always they felt alive. The kind of alive that doesn't need perfect manners or fine cutlery, just people together. Over time, though, people began to wonder. They watched their soup spill, their fingers burn, their food slip away, and as humans always do, they began to ask, what if this could be easier? That's where change began, not with a grand idea, but with a tiny wish for comfort. The first tool to join the table was simple, a stick. A carved branch used to stir the stew, to move the food around the fire. Soon after came the spoon, a curved shell on a handle, perfect for scooping and sipping. The table began to change. Eating wasn't just about hunger anymore. It was becoming something graceful. Still, there were problems. People could scoop and stir, but not lift or hold. Bread still tore unevenly. Food still slipped away. And in quiet kitchens and warm firesides, someone, somewhere, must have thought, what if something could pick things up? It wasn't an invention yet, just a small thought, a flicker in the long history of human need. The days passed, and people grew more curious about shape and comfort. They carved, bent, broke, and remade things. Each small change brought a bit more ease, a bit more peace at the table. It wasn't about progress or pride. It was about making mealtime softer, slower, a little kinder. The fork story begins here, in this gentle rhythm of people improving their days, not for glory, but for the quiet joy of sharing a meal, without burning their fingers. As nights passed and the fires dimmed, they left behind little pieces of that wish, the first shapes of something new, a tool that would one day become so common, we'd forget how strange it once seemed. And that's where the story starts, not with invention, but with a feeling that even simple things can always become a little better. Before the fork ever touched a plate, there was an age ruled by two quiet companions, the spoon and the stick. They were simple things, really. The stick came first, carved from wood, smoothed by hand, used to stir soups, flip meats, and poke at things too hot to touch. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. It became an extension of the hand, a bridge between people and the fire. And for a while, that was enough. Meals were slower then. There was time to sit, to listen to the crackle of the fire, to smell the smoke twist in the air. Food didn't arrive fast. It grew warm together with the stories being told. The stick was trusted. But sometimes, when the stew was thin or the broth deep, a stick wasn't enough. People wanted to scoop, to taste, to sip, and so came the spoon, born from a hollowed shell, piece of bone, or a carefully carved bit of wood. A small curve of kindness, really, a little cup that held warmth. The spoon changed everything. For the first time, people didn't just eat, they savored. They could hold comfort in their hands. Soups, stews, porridges, all became gentler, easier to share. And so began the age of the spoon and the stick. They worked side by side, the stick for stirring and serving, the spoon for tasting and soothing. Together, they brought a rhythm to mealtime, a calm that people came to love. Still, the table was messy. Fingers were used for much of the work, for picking meat, tearing bread, or holding fruit. It wasn't improper, just normal. The idea of eating with tools was still strange, a luxury, a novelty, but people were curious. Somewhere, someone began carving spoons with longer handles, making them from metal, bone, even clay. Others shaped sticks into pairs, what we now call chopsticks. In China, these twin tools became elegant, a dance between thumb and finger. They weren't just used to eat, they were a kind of art, a quiet grace at the table. Elsewhere, the spoon remained the favorite. Gentle, simple, easy to trust. People painted them, engraved them, passed them down through families. The spoon became something personal, a companion of comfort. For a long time, that's how things stayed. Every household had its spoon. Every kitchen had its stick. Meals were shared, not served. Food was an experience of closeness, of warmth, of patience. And yet, even in those peaceful rooms, curiosity lingered. The stick could stir. The spoon could scoop, but neither could truly hold food in place. Meats were slippery, vegetables rolled, and fine dishes, the kind served to kings and guests, demanded something more graceful. It wasn't about need anymore. It was about refinement, a quiet search for balance and beauty. And so, one evening, somewhere between the glow of firelight and the clatter of wooden bowls, someone must have looked at their spoon and thought, what if it had teeth? It's a funny thought, isn't it? The kind that sounds ridiculous at first, but changes everything. At first, maybe it was just an experiment, a spoon with tiny notches carved into it, or a stick split into two prongs. It wasn't quite a fork yet, but it was the start of an idea that the world would resist at first, laugh at, and then eventually couldn't live without. The spoon and the stick had carried humanity this far, but something new was waiting just over the horizon. Something small, simple, and quietly revolutionary. And so, as the fires dimmed and wooden spoons rested beside the bowls, a new curiosity began to shimmer in the minds of makers, a little thought with pointed ends, ready to change the table forever. There are moments in history when something small changes everything, and most people barely notice. The first fork was one of those moments. It didn't arrive with fanfare or ceremony. There wasn't a parade or a proclamation. It was quiet like all good beginnings. Somewhere, in a workshop that smelled of smoke and metal, a craftsman decided to make something new. Maybe he was tired of watching food slide away from his spoon, or maybe he just liked the idea of experimenting. Whatever the reason, one day he took a small piece of metal, flattened it, and shaped its end into two sharp points. It wasn't much to look at, more like a miniature pitchfork than a dining tool. But when he used it, something clicked. It held food steady. It didn't slip, didn't spill. It just worked. That small invention began to travel from one curious mind to another, from one table to the next. Merchants carried stories of it. Blacksmiths tried to copy it. And slowly the idea began to spread. In the great kitchens of Byzantium, the old empire of shining gold and domes, noble families began to notice. They loved elegance and anything that made dining feel refined. And so, the fork became a luxury, not a tool for everyone, but a symbol of grace. At grand feasts, where tables stretched the length of a hall, and chandeliers flickered with candlelight, servants began to bring out small, two-pronged forks. They weren't for eating whole meals, just for picking up bits of fruit or small pieces of meat. A little gesture of refinement. Guests would whisper, some impressed, some skeptical. "What's wrong with fingers?" they'd murmur. But others liked it, kept the hands clean, the gestures elegant, the table quiet. Soon, the fork began appearing at more and more noble tables, first in the east, then drifting toward the west. In Italy, it caught the eye of royalty. There are old stories, soft and half-forgotten, of a princess from Byzantium who brought her forks to Venice, astonishing everyone. At her feasts, she refused to touch food with her hands. Instead, she used her delicate golden fork, and people talked about it for months. Some admired her grace. Others mocked it, calling it strange, unnecessary, even sinful. Because yes, some priests believed forks were against God's design. They said, if God wanted us to eat with forks, He would have given us metal fingers. The princess didn't argue. She just smiled and kept using her fork. Change, as it always does, moved quietly. It didn't rush. It lingered, waited, slowly found its place. The fork remained rare, a luxury, a curiosity for the rich. But little by little, it began to catch on. Artisans started crafting forks in different shapes. 2 prongs, 3, sometimes even 4. Silver for the wealthy, wood for the humble. Each one told a story of patience, of people learning to live with something new. And though it still wasn't common, the fork had begun its journey, from tool to symbol, from curiosity to comfort. It didn't replace the spoon or the stick, not yet. Simply joined them, quietly sitting at the table, waiting for the world to grow used to its presence. And maybe that's what makes its story so beautiful. It wasn't a revolution. It was a whisper, a soft, persistent whisper that said, there's another way. And so the fork found its first home, in the hands of those who dined beneath chandeliers, where elegance was prized more than hunger. But its journey was only beginning. Soon it would travel beyond the castles and palaces, into the hands of ordinary people, and finally onto every table in the world. By now, the fork had been born, but it wasn't yet welcome. It sat in the hands of the wealthy, a small symbol of pride and of quiet rebellion against the old ways. The world, as always, was slow to change. Most people still ate with their hands. The spoon and the knife ruled the table. The fork, thin, delicate, strange, was seen as a thing for the rich, or for those who wanted to seem rich. In Italy, the noble families used forks at banquets, not for every meal, but for moments of display. The golden forks glimmered under candlelight, resting on silk tablecloths, as if saying, "Look at us, we dine differently." The guests would whisper and sometimes laugh. They said it looked too fancy, too unnecessary. Some even thought it made eating less human, too distant from the touch of food, from the warmth of sharing. But slowly, that strangeness began to fade, because elegance, once seen, is hard to forget. Forks started appearing in portraits of kings and queens. Silver forks, carved with intricate handles, with 2 or 3 prongs that caught the light just so. They weren't tools anymore, they were treasures. In grand dining halls, the act of eating became a performance. Every gesture mattered. The lift of the wrist, the angle of the bite, the sound of metal softly meeting porcelain. Forks gave rhythm to that performance. They made eating graceful, almost musical. And yet, outside those gilded halls, the world was different. Farmers still ate by hand. Sailors still tore bread with their fingers. Mothers still stirred porridge with wooden spoons. The fork hadn't reached them yet, not out of ignorance, but because life was simpler there. Meals weren't ceremonies, they were comfort, but the rich, they loved ceremony. And with every feast, with every royal dinner, the fork became more and more a symbol of class. In France, nobles began collecting them, showing off their sets, each fork unique, engraved with initials, resting in velvet cases. A fork was no longer just a utensil. It was a statement. Writers began to describe them in poems and journals. There are stories, soft, almost like gossip, of lords refusing to dine without their favorite fork, of ladies who kept their own, tucked into jeweled boxes, never to be shared. The fork had become personal, a thing of belonging and pride. But like all symbols of wealth, its charm eventually began to thin. As trade grew and people traveled, forks began to appear in merchant shops. Not gold, not silver, but iron, copper, wood. Simple, humble forks. And for the first time, ordinary people could afford them. They weren't perfect, sometimes bent, sometimes uneven, but they worked, and that was enough. It was the beginning of something quiet and inevitable, the fall of the fork from its throne of gold to the humble wooden tables of the everyday. Because in the end, every invention, no matter how royal its start, belongs to everyone. It just takes time. And so, in the glow of candles and the hum of noble laughter, a quiet revolution was brewing. Not the kind with fire or swords, but with meals, with families and hands, and a little metal tool that made things just a bit easier. The rich didn't know it yet, but the fork was about to leave their grand halls and find its way into homes where the walls were smaller and the warmth was far more real. And so the fork, once a treasure of the noble, began to wander through trade, through travel, through time. It drifted quietly until it reached the hands of ordinary people. And that's where its real story began. By now, the fork had seen the shine of gold and the glow of candles, but the real beauty of its story was still waiting, quietly in the homes of ordinary people. It began with trade, as so many quiet revolutions do. Merchants carried forks across seas, packed in crates beside spices, cloth, and tea. They were strange little things, oddly shaped, not yet trusted. But curiosity is a powerful traveler. In taverns and small shops, people would pick them up, turn them over in their hands, and wonder aloud, "What's this for?" Some thought it was a hair comb, others a blacksmith's tool. Few imagined it was for eating. But then someone, a traveler perhaps, or a cook with a curious mind, tried it, just once, to hold a piece of meat steady, to keep it from slipping, and it worked. It's funny how change spreads, not in big waves, but in tiny ripples. One person tells another, and then another, and before long, something strange becomes something familiar. The fork began appearing in humble kitchens. Not gold or silver now, but iron, wood, brass, even bone. Some were rough and uneven, handmade by local smiths. Others, smoother, shaped by careful hands. And at first, people laughed. They said, "What kind of fancy eating is this?" But soon, they stopped laughing because it made sense. It was easy, clean, comfortable. In Europe, by the 17th century, the fork had become a quiet fixture at many tables. It wasn't a sign of wealth anymore, just of habit, of ease. But still, some parts of the world resisted. In England, many clung to their knives and spoons. They called forks effeminate or unnecessary. Old habits are hard to let go of. People often think the way they've always done things is the way they should always be done. Yet time, patient, steady time, has a way of softening even the most stubborn hearts. As trade grew, as travelers moved from place to place, as ideas mingled over dinners and stories, the fork quietly won them over. No one noticed the exact day it happened, when it stopped being strange and started being normal. It just became part of life. Children grew up learning to hold it. Mothers set it beside the plate without thinking. Blacksmiths made them in bulk, each one a little easier to shape than the last. The fork had finally done what every invention dreams of. It had disappeared into everyday use. No one marveled at it anymore. No one spoke its name with awe. And somehow that was the greatest honor of all. Because the truest inventions, the ones that really matter, aren't the loud or grand ones. They're the quiet companions that make life just a bit more graceful. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the fork was everywhere. In farms, in cottages, in cities bursting with new ideas. It became a symbol of cleanliness, of order, of modern living. Even as the world changed, as factories rose, as steam and steel filled the air, the fork stayed the same. Simple, familiar, trusted. Every meal in every place, it waited beside the knife and the spoon, like an old friend who never asks for attention, but is always there when you need them. And in that quiet reliability, there was something beautiful. The fork had found its home, not in the hands of kings or scholars, but in the warmth of ordinary families, in laughter shared across small tables, in the hum of daily life. And so, the fork became what it was always meant to be, simple, steady, and at home everywhere. But before we end this journey, there's one last chapter, a moment to pause and notice what the fork really means, in the soft, quiet rhythm of our lives today. Every story, no matter how simple, has a moment when it becomes whole, when it stops trying to change, and simply is. This is that moment for the fork. By now, the fork had nothing left to prove. It had traveled across centuries and continents, through royal feasts and humble kitchens, and finally come to rest beside the knife and the spoon, as if it had always been there. And maybe that's the quiet magic of it, how something so small, so ordinary, can feel eternal. When you hold a fork now, you don't think about who made it or how long it took to become what it is. You don't think about the arguments it caused or the time it was seen as a symbol of vanity. You just use it, without question, without thought. And yet, within that simple action is an entire history of human hope. Because the fork isn't really just a tool. It's a reminder of our nature, to tinker, to shape, to soften the edges of our world, to look at what exists and quietly whisper, what if we made it a little better? Every time you lift it, you're touching that story, a story of patience, of curiosity, of gentle progress. It's not about invention in the grand, dramatic sense, not about genius or discovery. It's about care, about wanting things to be just a bit easier, a bit kinder, a bit more human. Somewhere, someone once burned their fingers on hot food and thought, there must be another way. And from that small thought came something that reached every home, every table, every meal. It's strange, isn't it? How much of life is built from moments like that? Tiny frustrations turned into quiet comforts, things we stop noticing because they work so perfectly that they no longer feel like inventions at all. The fork doesn't seek attention. It doesn't demand to be admired. It just waits, steady, silent, ready to help. And that's why it's beautiful, because true perfection isn't loud or proud. It's gentle, it's humble. It fits so seamlessly into our days that we forget it was ever new. Now it sits on every table, from the richest restaurant to the smallest kitchen, each one a small echo of that long journey. And maybe tonight, as you sit in the quiet and think about this oddly boring story, you'll realize it isn't boring at all. It's a story about us, about people who never stopped improving, never stopped caring about comfort, never stopped finding meaning in even the simplest things. So the next time you pick up a fork, whether it's silver or steel, plastic or wooden, shiny or scratched, remember, you're holding history, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that hums softly in the background of life, the kind that says, this too was made with love. And maybe that's the secret of it all, that in the end, everything we make, everything we build, is just another way of saying, I wanted life to feel a little gentler. And so, in its quiet perfection, the fork rests, a small, shining symbol of how even the simplest ideas can last forever. And now, as the story of the fork settles like the last warmth of a candle, the world grows still again. There's just one more part to whisper, a soft goodbye, a thank you, a gentle good night. And so our quiet little story comes to an end, not with a grand finish, not with applause, but with a calm breath, the kind that feels like home. The fork has found its place, just like everything eventually does. And maybe that's the lesson tonight, that even the smallest, most ordinary things carry a story worth listening to. Every tool, every habit, every comfort we have was once an idea, a hope someone shaped with patience and care. And that makes the world feel softer somehow, doesn't it? To know that behind every simple thing we touch, there's a quiet act of love. So as you lie there, in the stillness of your room, let that thought settle in, that progress doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums gently. Sometimes it's as simple as a spoon, a stick, or a fork. Let your thoughts slow down now. Let the story fade like the last trace of light on the wall. The day has already done its part, and the night is here to hold you still. The fork rests quietly on the table. The world is hushed, and your heart can rest too. Good night. Sleep softly and dream of small, kind things. The kind that make life just a little easier and the world a little gentler. you.